Chris Mannix, kind enough to join us in studio, New York City Man Cave, the NBA writer for Sports Illustrated. Let's set the record straight here. The Lakers said they got their man in Mike D'Antoni. What does that mean?
It means they got their man after their man. Look, Phil Jackson was always their guy, and there's so many layers to the story, so why don't we just start with Phil and where he played in. I mean, they went to Phil Jackson. They wanted Phil Jackson. He was their guy all along. But Phil, I mean, we have to remember how bad things were when Phil left the organization. You know, Phil was basically, he was going to go anyway, but he was shoved out the door by Jim Buss, who proceeded to then excise the organization of anyone that was ever associated with Phil Jackson, whether it's assistant coaches.
Except for Jeannie.
Except for Jeannie, which if he could, he probably would have. Except for Jeannie, except for, but trainers, assistant coaches, the equipment manager was broomed out after Phil Jackson. I mean, anything that had any connection to that regime was gone. So there were bad feelings there. And those bad feelings didn't go away after, say, a year or a year and a half, whatever. The other part of it is, if even with those bad feelings, if Phil had said, I'll take $12 million a year for 2 years, we'd be talking about Phil Jackson and the Lakers. If it was just as simple as money, the Lakers would have been more than willing to pay the freight to get Phil Jackson. They have a TV deal worth at least $150 million a year. Money was not an option for the Lakers. But Phil wanted a pound of flesh. And it wasn't just because it was the Lakers. He wanted a pound of flesh because this is what Phil wants to do now. You know, you go back to when the Orlando vacancy opened. Phil Jackson was talked about as a possibility with that team, but he wanted an organizational role. He wanted governorship of that team. And I don't know if it was ownership with the Lakers that he wanted, but he wanted significant input, if not final say, over personnel decisions. And if you're doing that, the three decision makers, Jim Buss, Jerry Buss, and Mitch Kupchak, two of them are now going to be against you. Because if Phil gets final say, what does that leave Jim Buss and Jerry and Mitch Kupchak to do? They've basically been marginalized to the point where they're irrelevant. So that right there during that meeting over the weekend was where things went completely south with Phil Jackson.
But if you look at just the basketball side of this, Phil's the right guy for this team.
I think Phil is the right guy for this team. After Mike got fired, I did sort of a flash poll with scouts that are guys that have watched the Lakers play this season. And I asked them who the best fit was, and three of them said Phil, and two of them even said Mike D'Antoni. But it was for Phil from the start because there's a comfort level with Kobe, with Metta World Peace, with Pau Gasol. Guys already know his offense. And the fact that he can walk into that locker room and immediately engender respect from that team. Yeah. He could immediately walk in, and they would have to respect him. They would probably learn the offense relatively quickly, since Gasol as well knows the offense and knows the system. But all that being said, Mike D'Antoni isn't the worst fit for this team. He's certainly a lot better than Nate McMillan, whose offenses have stunk, and Mike Dunleavy, as one scout told me this morning, you might as well have kept Bernie Bickerstaff if you're going to go out and hire Mike D'Antoni. But Mike can come in, and you have to appreciate the fact they're not going to have any training camp. They're just going to have to come in and learn an offense on the fly. And Mike's offense is by far and away the easiest offense for this team to learn right now.
What about Brian Shaw and the fact that you passed him over the first time? Now he's with the Pacers and has a decent job title here. But was there any thought of Brian Shaw?
There was no formal request for Brian Shaw. And I think from talking to people in Indiana, they would have resisted letting Brian Shaw go, only because it's midseason. Look, they're in the middle of the season. They believe they have a chance to win a championship this year. They've got a formidable roster. They took the Heat to the second round last year. They think they have a chance to come back, and Brian Shaw is a very, very intricate part of that team. He's close with most of the players. He's been Frank Vogel's right-hand man for a year now. They would have resisted. I don't know if they would have stopped him completely, but would have resisted sending him away. But Brian Shaw was part of that excision.
I know.
He wanted that job. He was endorsed by Kobe.
He should have gotten that job.
Looking back, he absolutely should have gotten that job. He was endorsed by Kobe, and they said basically, Brian, see you later. We don't want you to coach this team. We don't want you to assistant coach this team. We want you to have nothing to do with this team. So more bad feelings are involved. But let's talk about D'Antoni here for a second, Dan, and how he fits with this team. I think that he is the second best choice for this team, but it's not a slam dunk by any measure, because I've been talking to a lot of people this morning, scouts that have watched the way Mike coaches, and the problem they keep coming back to is with Kobe. Because look at the way Mike's coached his teams in the past and the personnel that he has. What's the shooting guard been? He's been a shooter.
I know.
He's been a spot-up shooter in the corner. Joe Johnson, Landry Fields. I mean, these guys, Joe's a better example. Joe's a great player, but he was also more of a shooter when he was with Phoenix. Now you have Mike D'Antoni in L.A., and you can't just make Kobe a shooter. You can't just have him say, Kobe, you see that right there? You stand in the corner, and we'll get you the ball when we feel like it. He has to figure out a way to make that work. It'll work with Gasol because Gasol doesn't care. He just wants touches underneath the rim. He wants to get his 15 to 18 points per game, and he'll probably get that in Mike's system. Dwight might be a different story too, though. Dwight's not going to be happy being a dunker and a defender. You have to run plays for Dwight Howard to make him happy. So somewhere along the line, Mike D'Antoni has to make this team evolve, or make his offensive system evolve to get better. And he's got to figure out the defense, too. The defense stinks. It's not going to get better under Mike D'Antoni. I can't imagine any situation where it would get better under Mike D'Antoni. So there are a lot of variables to consider that Mike might not be successful in this situation.
He's Chris Mannix from Sports Illustrated, covers the NBA for the magazine. And you brought up a valid point. That's what I said about Kobe. This fits Steve Nash because this is his offense. It was created for Steve Nash within him in mind. Dwight Howard was not in this style. Pau Gasol is the European style player.
He doesn't care either.
Yeah.
Give me my paycheck. Let me stay in L.A. and let me get my points. That's all he cares about. That was perfectly clear when he got the aborted trade to Houston happen. Nobody was happier than Pau Gasol. It's like, oh, God, thank God for being the number one option again.
But you have Kobe. What I didn't understand is, did they even take the triangle offense out because it was a reminder of Phil Jackson, even though it would be best suited for this team, even when Mike Brown was there?
There's a reason only one coach coaches the triangle, or two when Kirk Rambis was coaching the Timberwolves. It's not easy. And you have to have, not just the head coach that knows it. You have to have an assistant coach that knows it. Tex Winter was Phil's right-hand man for years.
But wasn't it the right system for this team?
It was
not
successful.
The Princeton-style offense.
Oh, more than the Princeton. The Princeton was a disaster.
I watched that first game, Chris, and I said, what is Steve Nash doing?
Well, let's remember this. They hired Eddie Jordan. Basically, they didn't officially hire him until later when they made the announcement, like late September, early October. But they knew they were going to bring Eddie Jordan in July. I remember Eddie was at I think it was Las Vegas for the USA basketball camp, and he was there with Mike Brown. They were talking to Kobe. That's when Kobe got excited about it. That was pre-Steve Nash and pre-Dwight Howard. So maybe I can see that if you're going to have a point guard that just stands around like a Steve Blake or a Derek Fisher, and you're going to have Gasol who can fit into that kind of offense, maybe it works. But once you bring the personnel in that you have, once you bring Steve and Dwight into the fold, the Princeton offense made absolutely no sense. They should have just gone heavy pick and roll and said, sorry, we made a mistake.
I'm still shocked with the whole Phil Jackson thing, but I do understand what you're saying. And this came down to Jim Buss and Phil Jackson. And Phil saying, Jim, you want me? You need me? Going to cost you? There's no discount because, I'm dating your sister. It's going to cost you dearly.
What must that sit down have looked
that
like?
would have been
I
awesome.
would have given all the money in my bank account to have been there and sat down and said, look, let's see Jim Buss sitting there groveling to Phil Jackson, being like, oh, Phil, please, you got to come back. We're screwed. Dad's going to take away my keys to the executive washroom. I'm not going to get, this is going to be bad for me. You got to make this work. And Phil just sitting there being like, I want this, I want this, I want this. And I don't blame Phil one bit.
DeMarcus Cousins with the Sacramento Kings. So he apparently challenged Sean Elliott
Sharks and the Jets.
So he confronted Sean Elliott, who's a broadcaster now for the Spurs after a game.
Right.
What was this based on something Sean had said?
Sean criticized Cousins during the game. Remember, Sean was a teammate of Tim Duncan, and Cousins during the game, I watched that game, the replay of that game, and I saw that Cousins was talking a lot of smack to Tim Duncan. He had a couple of good moves on him. So Sean immediately jumps to Duncan's defense and says, you can't behave like that. Then Duncan goes off and gets a couple on Cousins, and more or less that he defended Tim Duncan and did it in a vehement way. So Cousins, after the game, is told about what Sean Elliott said, does his whole post-game interview. This is like half an hour. Does his whole post-game interview with his uniform on, goes back onto the court, and confronts Sean Elliott what the NBA termed was a hostile manner. And what I was told was that Sean actually had to walk away from it before it might have escalated even more. So Sean was the one that walked away, and Cousins stayed on the floor. NBA slaps him with a 2-game suspension. I was told it was for two reasons. Number one, it's DeMarcus Cousins, and he's done this kind of stuff like 20 times before. Number two, it's like I just said, you can't come out of the locker room with your uniform still on and confront a broadcaster. That's team personnel. That's like confronting a PR guy, basically, in the way the NBA views it. But he comes out into the floor and confronts the guy 30 minutes after the game. If it had happened right there on the floor, right after immediately aftermath of the game, they probably would have let it go, maybe slapped him with a $20,000 fine. But half an hour later, when temperatures should have cooled, he comes back out on the floor. Not a good day, not a good career for DeMarcus Cousins.
Boy, what a surprise a local broadcaster sticking up for the local hero.
Well, Sean Elliott, I will say that Sean Elliott's a massive homer. He might be the ultimate homer in NBA broadcast. Great guy. I mean, and he's had a great backstory, obviously, with the kidney issue back in the day. But, really just a massive homer.
All right, before I let you go, the team that comes out of the West this year is who?
Have you ever once on this show heard me pick against the Oklahoma City Thunder? Honestly, this is part of the Laker mix.
Okay, if Phil was coaching the Lakers,
I'd still take Oklahoma City.
Okay, that's fine.
Look, this is part of the whole problem with the Lakers, that the defense we already talked about, but that bench is horrible.
Yes.
They were the worst scoring bench in the league last year. They revamped the entire thing, bringing Anton Jameson, Jody Meeks, Robert Sacre's there. they're still the worst or second worst scoring bench in the league. And you can't just fix that with a coach. So you've got defensive problems, which are only going to get worse or not sustainably better under Mike D'Antoni. And you've got a bad bench. I think you look at Oklahoma City, you look at San Antonio, and you look at Memphis. Last night, Memphis kicked the crap out of Miami. That was a great game for the Memphis Grizzlies. They dominated Miami from start to finish. That team with a healthy Zach Randolph is better than the Lakers right now.
Look at you. That's a walk-off right there, Mannix. He's Chris Mannix. Well, let's say stand-up and walk-off, by the way.
Gotcha.
Chris Mannix from Sports Illustrated. That's it. He's just got. It's a walk-off. Just keep walking out the door, Chris. That's a walk-off right there. Chris Mannix from SI.com covering the NBA.